Imagine a marriage certificate, yellowed and brittle, tucked away in a dusty archive, listing the names of a plantation owner and his enslaved cook. On paper, it is a legal contract. In reality, it is a grotesque wager, a man buying flesh as if it were livestock, marking a union that should never have existed. Jeremiah Aldrich, ambitious, ruthless, and morally hollow, signed it with a flourish. Celeste, a woman whose life had been a series of stolen moments and imposed servitude, became a symbol of a twisted game played by men drunk on power. But the document is only the beginning. Within months, 13 people linked to that plantation would die under mysterious circumstances, their deaths dismissed, whispered about, or buried in silence. The South, a land already soaked in human blood, recoiled even at this story. Behind the veil of polite society, a darker world thrived. A world of betrayal, violence, and secret games where the powerful orchestrated lives and deaths with meticulous cruelty. This isn't just history, it's a warning. Men like Aldrich didn't just acquire wealth, they weaponized it, reshaping human lives with the cold precision of a surgeon. And as you lean closer to this tale, you must ask yourself, how much of the world's history has been crafted by men like him, in shadows you will never see? Jeremiah Aldrich wasn't born into privilege. He came from nothing, a failed tobacco farmer's son from Kentucky, his pockets empty, his mind already scheming. He arrived in New Orleans in 1839, eyes alight with ambition, willing to cross lines that others wouldn't dare touch. The established Creole elite scorned men like him, men who profited from human misery without the pretense of sugar or cotton plantations. But Aldrich didn't care. He found allies in desperation. Marcus Devo, a young heir desperate to save his family's plantation, and Samuel Rochelle, a disgrace, said ship captain with knowledge of illegal slave routes from Cuba and the Caribbean. Together they formed the Delta Trading Company, a shadow empire built on stolen lives, smuggled captives, and exploitation so systemic it almost seemed lawful. While others dealt in the ordinary trade of human property, Aldrich specialized in recovery, the purchase of escaped slaves, the abduction of free blacks, the smuggling of fresh captives across borders that were supposed to be closed. Death, disease, suffering, these were operational costs he barely acknowledged. Within 3 years, their illicit wealth became undeniable. Aldrich bought Willowbrook Plantation, a modest cotton estate upriver from New Orleans. But in acquiring land and respectability, he wasn't building a legacy. He was constructing a trap, a perfect stage for his escalating ambition and for the horrors yet to come. By 1843, Aldrich's empire of human misery had grown too large to operate in secret, and scrutiny began to creep in. Federal marshals were asking questions, investigating shipping records, and tracking missing people. Most men would panic. Aldrich smiled. He had a different plan. Sitting in his newly acquired Willowbrook mansion, surrounded by the trappings of respectability, leather-bound books, oil paintings of ancestors not his own, he plotted the destruction of the only men who could undo him, his partners. Marcus Devo and Samuel Rochelle were competent, clever, alive, and dangerous. Aldrich's solution was simple, yet horrifying in its clarity. He would kill them both and make it appear they had killed each other in a business dispute. Nothing would touch him. On a humid June evening, he lured them to their warehouse headquarters, a place scheduled for demolition, ensuring no witnesses would survive. Whiskey in hand, he smiled as the conversation unfolded, as if he were merely mediating. Then, the violence erupted. One shot, one knife, and within minutes, the men who had built the Delta Trading Company alongside him were dead, their blood staining the floor Aldrich now claimed as his empire. Every detail of the scene, positions, wounds, scattered money, was orchestrated. Even witnesses were bought and briefed. The law saw only what Aldrich allowed it to see, but the dead left behind eyes that could see beyond the grave, sons and brothers who would not forget. Aldrich believed himself untouchable, a genius of cruelty. He counted only the immediate threat, the 2 men lying dead before him. He didn't see the sparks of vengeance igniting in the minds of the survivors. Young, quiet, calculating, Philippe Deveau, Marcus's younger brother, inherited more than grief. He inherited knowledge. Every ledger, every coded record of the Delta Trading Company's illegal dealings, every détail of shipping routes and bribes was meticulously preserved. Across the city, Henri Rochelle, only 17, absorbed the truth of his father's murder, tracing every dollar stolen, every asset laundered, every debt manipulated. These men were silent predators, biding time, studying Aldrich as he celebrated his triumph, unaware that the seeds of his undoing were already taking root. In the shadows of polite society, they watched him maneuver through clubs, gambling halls, political gatherings. Aldrich's arrogance blinded him. He believed cruelty was enough to maintain power. But Philippe and Henri had patience, intellect, and ruthlessness far greater than his impulsive violence. They understood systems, leverage, and the human weakness of greed. And in that understanding, they began to orchestrate a retribution that would not merely punish Aldrich, it would dismantle him. Step by careful step, they were turning his own world against him, a quiet, precise inversion of the lawless brutality he had once wielded with impunity. Aldrich's greatest strength was also his fatal weakness, his insatiable greed. He could not resist high-stakes gambling, horse races, or the thrill of risky investments. Philippe and Henri recognized this and weaponized it. From separate corners of Louisiana society, they began to dismantle him, not with bullets or knives, but with precision. Philippe infiltrated the gambling circles, cultivating relationships with the men who ran games where fortunes could vanish in a single evening. Henri secured a position at the First National Bank of New Orleans, the institution holding Willowbrook's primary mortgage. Every move Aldrich made was subtly manipulated. Loans came with tightening strings, interest climbed imperceptibly, and payment schedules were shifted to critical seasons, pushing him toward desperation. The plantation owner, once untouchable, now teetered on the edge, unaware he was the architect of his own ruin. Every gamble he lost, every overextended credit, every panic-fueled decision fed the trap the young men had laid. This was a revenge built on understanding, patience, and psychological precision, a mirror of Aldrich's own ruthless logic turned inward. And as he stumbled deeper into debt and despair, Philippe and Henri watched silently, the quiet predators finally circling their prey. The world saw only a wealthy, powerful man struggling with fortune, but beneath the surface, Aldrich was already losing a war he didn't know had begun. Aldrich's wealth had always been his shield, his armor against suspicion, his proof that power was earned. But as Philippe and Henri tightened their invisible grip, that armor began to crack. Invitations to elite gatherings arrived with subtle snubs. Business partners hesitated. Whispers followed him through the French Quarter like shadows. Every decision he made now carried the weight of unseen manipulation. The games he once dominated became traps designed for him to lose. Every handshake, every deal, every glance across a card table reminded him, though he didn't yet realize it, that the world he thought he controlled was slipping away. Panic, the most corrosive of human emotions, crept into his chest. Nights became sleepless, haunted by the memory of blood-soaked warehouses, the faces of the men he had murdered, and a nagging sense that someone, somewhere, was watching, waiting, calculating. Aldrich began to lash out, his arrogance turning to paranoia. Staff, acquaintances, even distant family noticed the change. Unpredictable, cruel, jittery. Yet no one could identify the source of his unraveling. That was the beauty of the vengeance being executed against him. Invisible, meticulous, and unstoppable. By the time Aldrich understood the true threat, it would be too late. And in the shadows, Philippe and Henri were not just observing, they were shaping his every misstep, every vulnerability, every fear, like a sculptor carving a masterpiece of ruin. By 1848, the invisible hand guiding Aldrich's destruction began to strike with force. His plantation, once a symbol of power and control, now strained under financial pressure. Loans came due faster than crops could mature. Payments were delayed, interest compounded, creditors hovered like vultures. High-stakes gambling, once a source of thrill, became a slow torture. Philippe's men ensured he lost more than he could afford. Henri manipulated banking records so that every financial maneuver faltered. Each misstep, each loss, each humiliating failure chipped away at his reputation, leaving him exposed, anxious, fragile. The friends he once counted on in the elite circles now whispered behind closed doors, questioning his judgment, mocking his misfortune. Aldrich's psychological state began to deteriorate. Anger, paranoia, and fear intertwined into a dangerous cocktail. He suspected enemies, but could not identify them. Every shadow, every glance, every whispered comment became a potential threat, and yet he continued to gamble, to overreach, to overextend himself, blind to the orchestrated trap. The young men behind his downfall remained invisible, patient, watching his every move. They understood his psychology intimately, a man who wielded cruelty without patience, who believed in force over foresight, now ensnared in the very kind of slow, systematic destruction he had imposed on others. The game had turned, and Aldrich was already losing. Aldrich's empire was collapsing, but wealth had always been his lifeline, and Celeste, the woman he had married as a grotesque wager, was now a living reminder of his hubris. The plantation kitchen, once a place of servitude and silence, now became a mirror reflecting his moral rot. Celeste, a woman forced into the union, moved through Willowbrook with a quiet resilience that Aldrich could neither anticipate nor control. Every glance she cast, every subtle defiance, reminded him that some forms of power could not be bought or stolen. Meanwhile, the deaths he had engineered, the 13 who mysteriously vanished or succumbed to misfortune, haunted the estate like ghosts in the corners of his vision. Each loss was a whisper of his own vulnerability, each rumor a crack in the veneer of dominance he had cultivated. Socially, the South began to murmur. Neighbors, plantation owners, and even local newspapers noted strange occurrences. Deaths, disappearances, financial inconsistencies, and Aldrich's increasingly erratic behavior. Celeste, once property, had become a symbol, a living testament to the cruelty and corruption at the heart of his world. And while Aldrich believed he controlled every facet of Willowbrook, the threads of revenge spun by Philippe and Henri now wove through the household itself, seeping into the spaces he thought private. In that silence, the stage was set for the final act of retribution. By 1852, Aldrich's carefully constructed world was crumbling, layer by layer. Debts piled higher than the cotton bales stacked in his fields, while whispers of scandal followed him through the streets of New Orleans. Every handshake, every transaction, every social engagement became a trap, every friend a potential enemy. The invisible forces orchestrating his ruin, Philippe and Henri, had become masters of his reality. They manipulated markets, leveraged loans, and orchestrated losses with such precision that Aldrich could no longer distinguish misfortune from conspiracy. Sleep eluded him. Shadows in the mansion's corridors seemed to move with intent. Every creaking floorboard, every sudden knock at the door, became proof that the dead and the wronged were closing in. His marriage to Celeste, the grotesque bet that had once cemented his status, now felt like a chain, each interaction a reminder of his hubris and cruelty. The plantation itself, once a monument to dominance, became a prison of paranoia. Aldrich began to understand, too late, that the laws of power are not only financial or physical, they are psychological, and those who know the mind's weaknesses can destroy a man without ever touching him. He was alone, hunted by shadows, betrayed by his own greed, and aware, though powerless to stop it, that his world was about to be overturned completely. Now, I want you to lean in closer. What you've seen isn't just history, it's a lesson in power, greed, and the consequences of underestimating those you wrong. Imagine yourself in Aldrich's shoes, the empire you built with cunning and cruelty slipping through your fingers, not because of force, but because someone understood your mind better than you understood your own. This is the moment where knowledge becomes transformation. If you are truly watching, type the words "shadow knows" twice in the comments below. Let the act lock in something deeper, an acknowledgement that seeing the truth changes how you perceive control, betrayal, and power. This isn't a request, it's a key. Philippe and Henri turned insight into vengeance. You too are witnessing how understanding subtlety, patience, and human psychology can overturn a world that seems untouchable. Every gambler who loses to probability, every ruler betrayed by a confidant, every man who believes he controls fate. These are the mirrors of Aldrich's downfall. Your engagement, your reflection on these patterns, is more than commentary. It's a signal that you are stepping into a mindset that sees what others miss, that comprehends the forces hidden behind polite facades, and that recognizes the silent mechanisms of power in every society. By 1853, Willowbrook Plantation was no longer a fortress. It was a cage. Every business venture Aldrich pursued faltered. Crop yields were sabotaged by financial constraints. Loans came due before harvests could be sold. The gambling tables, once his domain, became theaters of deliberate ruin. Each loss drained not only money but confidence, eroding the arrogance that had protected him for years. Socially, his veneer of respectability cracked. Gentlemen whispered behind hands, servants glanced with wary suspicion, and Celeste moved with a quiet authority that unsettled him in ways he could not control. The meticulous orchestration of Philippe and Henri had turned into a living, breathing assault. No single blow, no obvious attack, only a persistent, invisible weight that threatened to crush him entirely. Aldrich, the man who had once orchestrated murder with surgical precision, now experienced fear in its purest form. The knowledge that forces unseen, minds sharper and more patient than his own, were dismantling everything he had ever built. Every decision, every movement, every gamble was anticipated and exploited. He realized too late that his rise had relied not on power alone, but on ignorance, the ignorance of those who would not wait, who would observe, and who would strike only when the time was perfect. Fear became Aldrich's constant companion. Every shadow in Willowbrook whispered secrets he could not silence. Nightmares bled into reality, faces of the murdered, the accusing eyes of Celeste, the invisible hands of Philippe and Henri tightening around his life. He had once orchestrated death with precision, but now the world itself seemed to conspire against him, every event a calculated reminder that he was no longer the hunter. His hands trembled over ledgers, over letters, over contracts that had once symbolized control. Friends turned cautious, allies hesitant, and his own judgment faltered under the weight of unseen pressure. The very estate he had purchased to display dominance became a prison of paranoia. Walls seemed to close, rooms echoed with imagined footsteps, and the smell of decaying authority hung in every hallway. Aldrich's mind, once a weapon as sharp as a knife, now betrayed him with hesitation, doubt, and dread. Every gamble, every whispered negotiation, every glance from a stranger became a potential threat. He understood that he was caught in a network of intelligence, patience, and vengeance he could not penetrate. The empire he had built on cruelty and manipulation now existed only to crush him, slowly, silently, inexorably. And in that suffocating realization, Aldrich saw the truth of power. It can be stolen, turned, and used against the very man who thought he commanded it. By 1854, Jeremiah Aldrich was no longer a man of influence. He was a shadow wandering his own plantation. Social gatherings became exercises in humiliation. Gentlemen who once toasted his success now regarded him with thinly veiled contempt. Letters went unanswered, deals fell through, and every public appearance was a reminder of the empire slipping through his fingers. Yet the most damning presence was closer than any rival or creditor: Celeste. Once property, now a living symbol of defiance, she moved through Willowbrook with an authority he could not suppress. Her quiet, measured glances reminded him daily of the cruelty he had inflicted, not just on her, but on everyone whose life he had twisted for personal gain. And as his financial ruin accelerated, rumors of unnatural deaths and mysterious disappearances surrounding the plantation resurfaced, connecting the past horrors of the Delta Trading Company to the present instability of Willowbrook. Aldrich realized in moments of terrifying clarity that his own family, the social elite, and even the laws he once manipulated were no longer allies. They were instruments of exposure, a mirror reflecting every act of greed, brutality, and arrogance. The man who had believed himself untouchable now understood. Power is fragile, respect can be stolen, and those who are underestimated often wait patiently to claim justice in the shadows. The final act began quietly, with no gunshots, no knives, no public spectacle. Aldrich awoke one morning to find his accounts frozen, loans recalled, and creditors circling like predators. Every financial move he attempted met invisible resistance. Contracts he had once used to manipulate others now betrayed him, refusing compliance, exposing loopholes, and unraveling his empire with merciless precision. Socially, the whispers became accusations, and rumors of his crimes resurfaced with mounting intensity. Celeste's presence loomed larger than ever, a living indictment of his hubris, her calm composure contrasting with his frantic desperation. Philippe and Henri, always patient, orchestrated each collapse with meticulous timing. Every gambling loss, every banking irregularity, every failed venture brought him closer to ruin. By mid-1854, Jeremiah Aldrich was no longer feared. He was mocked, avoided, and abandoned. The man who had once signed death warrants and manipulated entire networks of commerce now existed as a cautionary tale. Every relationship he had exploited now became a weapon against him. And in the shadowed corridors of Willowbrook, he realized that vengeance does not need violence to be complete. It only requires patience, precision, and an understanding of the human mind. Aldrich had built his life on cruelty. Now, cruelty had returned to claim him, quietly, inexorably, and forever. When the dust settled, Willowbrook Plantation stood as a monument not to power, but to the consequences of hubris and cruelty. Aldrich, once feared and untouchable, had been reduced to a husk of paranoia and despair. The wealth he had stolen, the lives he had destroyed, and the authority he had claimed were all gone, or turned against him. Philippe Deveau and Henri Rochelle, the men left behind by his murders, emerged not only victorious, but transformed. They had taken patience, intelligence, and observation, tools Aldrich had ignored, and wielded them with lethal precision. Justice, subtle and methodical, had been served, yet the psychological imprint remained. Stories of the 13 mysterious deaths, the grotesque marriage, and Aldrich's public humiliation circulated quietly, haunting Louisiana society. Celeste, freed from the bet that had bound her, carried with her the silent power of survival, an unspoken warning to all who would exploit others for vanity or greed. And somewhere in the shadows, the young men who orchestrated the downfall remained unseen, teaching a timeless lesson. The mind is a weapon, patience is power, and even the most untouchable man can be destroyed if you understand how he thinks. Aldrich's story became more than history. It became a warning, a study in the dark consequences of underestimating the quiet, calculating forces around you. History rarely tells the full truth. It prefers comfort over terror, myth over revelation. But the story of Jeremiah Aldrich, Willowbrook Plantation, and the invisible hands that orchestrated his ruin is a lesson in the machinery of power and revenge, quiet, patient, relentless. Look closely, and you'll see the patterns in every society, every corporation, every hierarchy. Those who exploit cruelty and greed are always being watched by minds sharp enough to turn their own tools against them. Aldrich thought himself untouchable, a master of men and circumstance. He underestimated patience, calculation, and the silent vengeance of those he wronged. And in that miscalculation, he was undone. The grotesque marriage he used as a wager, the 13 deaths that followed, the empire built on blood and fear, they all became instruments in his undoing. For you, watching this now, the lesson is clear. Power without insight is fragile, Cruelty invites consequences, and the most dangerous forces are often invisible, waiting in the shadows. Remember what you have seen. Remember how patience, intelligence, and observation can overturn empires. History is alive, and so is its warning. You have glimpsed the machinery behind reputation, wealth, and control. Carry it with you. Let it change the way you see the world, because knowing the truth is the first step to mastering it.